Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome back to Business Unusual. This is a daily live show brought to you by the LinkedIn News team, where we're talking as a community about the changing nature of work. I'm Caroline Fairchild, editor-at-large here at LinkedIn, coming to you from my home office here in New York City. In wake of national protests against police killings of Black Americans, venture capitalists have joined the chorus of executives speaking out in support of the Black community. Yet, as many have pointed out, Black founders have not had equal access to venture capital since the inception of the industry itself. In 2019, just 1% of venture-backed founders were Black. Now we're seeing executives from venture capital firms not just post their support of the Black community, but put dollars behind those posts as well. Last week, SoftBank Group unveiled a $100 million opportunity growth fund to invest in U.S. startups founded by entrepreneurs of color, particularly Black and Hispanic founders. Andreessen Horowitz also announced a philanthropic fund to provide seed capital and a 10-month training program to entrepreneurs from underserved communities. On today's show, we'll get to speak with two venture capitalists who've been thinking about diversity from their fund since its inception. Henri Pierre-Jacques, as well as Jared Tingle from Harlem Capital, will be joining us to discuss their fund and how they're thinking about this process and how they're advising other venture capital firms during this time as well. We'll also get the opportunity to speak to two venture-backed founders to get their take on how the venture capital industry needs to change to become more equitable. Bea Dixon from the plant-based beauty startup Honey Pot will join us, as well as Porter Braswell from Jopwell. It's a diversity hiring startup. But before we bring on our guests, I want to hear from you. The whole point of this show is to have a conversation as a community about the changing nature of work in light of the coronavirus, in light of these national protests. How are things going on the ground for you? What questions do you have for our guests? Let us know in the stream, and we'll have a conversation about that on today's show. And with that, I want to bring on Henri as well as Jared. Hi, thank you guys so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Henri, I want to start with you. I know that you were in Harlem over the weekend at the protests. For our listeners and viewers right now from around the country and the world, can you tell us a little bit about what that experience was like in Harlem over the weekend?
Yeah, so my wife and I joined some of the protests. Our church and a bunch of other churches in Harlem march over the weekend. It was a really great experience. My wife is actually her first protest, which I know is true for a lot of people. And so it's been a really time for people to use their voice. And for us, it was great. It was probably a couple thousand people. We just spoke. We stopped at a bunch of key marks that are in Harlem. So there's a Black church on 125th. There's a Schomburg Center, which is African American Museum in Harlem. And we stopped at a school, which is in North Harlem. And so I think the significance of going through the history of Harlem and what it represents for Black excellence and the Black Renaissance really was powerful to be a part of that peaceful protest as well.
And Jared, of course, the name of your fund and your firm is Harlem Capital. So talk to us a little bit about when the fund was conceived and how you guys are responding right now to these protests. And I'm sure speaking with a lot of other venture capitalists about what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we started in 2015. We were an angel syndicate, just wanted to opportunistically invest as friends. It became more and more serious as we went along. We came up with the name Harlem Capital because we were living in Harlem. We also recognize significance. It's been a beacon for Black and Latinx communities for decades now. And then you have the Harlem Renaissance, which was really a cultural revolution around art. But we definitely see some positives that are going to happen on the business side for Harlem. So thought the name would make sense for us. Fast forward, we raised a $40 million fund, and now we are where we are. In terms of how you've been responding as a firm, we have not, protested as a firm. It's going to be an individual decision. I have a little one at home. So my situation is different, but we think we have a very strong platform that we can use to empower folks. So we did put out a statement. We thought a very thoughtful, but also balanced statement about what's going on and the historical implications. And we're continuing to try to empower founders. We've been backing minorities and women for over 4 years now. So this is not new for us. We're not new to these issues, but we do think the additional light and attention will help us continue to push the mission forward.
Henri, Jared says this is not new to you. This has been the thesis of your fund since the beginning. As you're advising other venture capitalists who are thinking about how to respond, what are you hearing from them on the ground in terms of, if it's new to them, how they're thinking about these issues hopefully differently now?
Yeah, I mean, I think some people already had things that they were working on. The partners now are much more aware. And so whether it be SoftBank or other firms, things are getting accelerated at a pace that probably wouldn't have happened otherwise. I think, our advice that I've given to a lot of my friends is, hey, you can say you're going to put dollars for it, but that doesn't change the institutional processes you have. So don't expect for you to say, oh, I'm going to now donate or have this amount of money, and all of a sudden more Black founders are going to come to you. what are you doing to actually change your process, especially during a COVID time where you can't host events, right? And so how are you reaching out to other firms like us, the accelerators, to make sure you actually have that pipeline and funnel? I think that's one thing I really challenge people is don't just expect things to change. You have to change your firm. You have to reevaluate why has a sourcing funnel that you have existing does not work to actually lead to more diversity.
And for those of you who are just joining the stream, this is Business Unusual, a live show where we are talking as a community about the changing nature of work. Today on today's show, we're talking about inequities within the venture capital industry. I want to say hello to some people who are joining us in the stream: Lawrence from Phoenix, Janet from South Dakota, Carlton from Maryland, Sherry from New Jersey, and Brittany from California. Thanks for joining us on today's discussion. Jared, there's people from all over the country, but venture capital is a very small industry that a lot of people don't really have a lot of information on. Henry was just talking a little bit about the inequities and some of the institutions around venture capital. Talk to us a little bit, for those who are on the stream who aren't familiar with how close-knit the venture capital community is and how you are thinking differently about your fund in terms of making it more accessible to not just founders, say, from San Francisco that look a certain type of way.
Yeah, so VC has been very insular, closely held. It started really clustered around Silicon Valley. There are also centers in New York, Boston, LA now, but it's a very network-driven game. Ultimately, what you're doing is helping founders make their dreams come true, but you're backing them at a time where things aren't proven. You don't have 10 years of financial history. You really are betting on the passion, the vision, execution ability of a founder. So from that standpoint, it's been tough for minorities to break in because of information asymmetry, as well as just the pervasive network effects. I think Richard Kirby ran a study and he found that 40% of VCs went to Harvard or Stanford, right? So from our vantage point, we know minorities are very adept and able to do the same things that the majority founders have, but they haven't been given the opportunity over the years. So there's a couple things at play. I think one is the fact that these VC firms, just in general, aren't diverse at all. They're small organizations in terms of headcount. They don't turn over that much. There's no natural way for them to diversify unless they're doing it intentionally. They're just going to continue to go to people that look like them to make them feel comfortable. The other thing that you're seeing in VC is that there's a power law dynamic where when you invest in companies, you have a select few that really do generate the vast majority of your returns. So what that means is on an individual basis, you're going to want to just pattern recognize for who's been successful previously, which tends to be a white guy who went to Harvard or Stanford, maybe worked at a tech firm for a few years, maybe started a company before. But point is, there's a structural barriers that prevents minorities and women from really getting equal access to capital. And I do think that the diversity of the VCs themselves leads to lack of funding for diverse founders.
And Henri, other sources haven't been tracking the diversity within venture capital firms by race, but your firm recently did its own analysis and found that there are 200 Black and Latinx founders across 161 funds. To break us down for how small that is and perhaps what needs to change to make the industry more accessible. Jared was just talking about how little turnover there is amongst these firms. So where is the change going to happen?
Yeah, so there's 200 Black Latino founders who raised $1 million that we found. So most of the resources like Crunchbase and PitchBook track by gender, not by race. I do think that's going to change based on conversations that have been happening recently with those resource organizations. And so we actually have to do a lot of work going to LinkedIn pages, articles, looking at pictures, what language do people speak in their LinkedIn, to try to figure out, is this a Black Latino founder, and how much have they raised? And so we started doing that for ourselves internally because people were telling us, hey, you can't start a diversity-focused firm. There's a pipeline issue. Nobody actually knew what the pipeline was. And so we said, okay, why don't we research it for ourselves? Eventually, once we actually started to have that and track it, we said this is something that would benefit the ecosystem. We should show it to others, for other founders to know there are other founders like me who have raised in my industry or in my geography. And people would reach out to us and say, thank you for letting me know that there's somebody else, because it can be very lonely. Or for other investors to also know that, hey, there are founders. There's not a pipeline issue. You just aren't tracking them. And so that was something that we've continued to do the last 3 years, and hopefully, now these racial events will lead to the large organizations like PitchBook and Crunchbase to actually do it and either allow founders to self-select their race, or to do the research themselves like we've been doing. But we do think that data drives decisions, and that none of this will change until you have more people actually looking at the data. A lot more VC firms are now actually analyzing their portfolios and realizing how undiverse their portfolios are, how undiverse their LP base is. And so once people actually begin to track those things, hopefully the LP base and the founder base will change.
Jared, it's still such early days, and venture capitalists are coming out in mass on LinkedIn and off LinkedIn, responding to these protests with these posts of support. We're seeing a couple funds crop up as well. Are you optimistic that there will be long-term impact like Henri was talking about? Are there things other than tracking in the data that we can look to really level set and make sure that venture capitalists are pushing the industry forward through this movement?
We're optimistic. We're cautiously optimistic, though, because we know how hard of a road it was for us to get off the ground. Fortunately, we're able to do it, but there's a lot of inertia around people actually funding diverse founders. And it's not just a VC issue. If you look at capital generally, whether that's hedge fund managers, private equity managers, asset managers in the stock market, wherever there's real money being exchanged, it's just never flowing to the hands of minorities and women. So it is a real structural thing. We do think VC is very important, though, because this is literally the earliest stage for some type of businesses to get funding. So we do think that is where you should focus your time and energy. So we are optimistic. I mean, right now it's trendy to be speaking about, Black issues and about, Black Lives Matter and everything going on right now. But these issues aren't new. They're centuries in the making. They're decades in the making. And it's really tough to avoid protests in 50 states and various countries around the world. And then just the fact that we're on pause right now with the lockdown, with COVID, with no sports, with no events, et cetera, there's a lot of attention being on. I have seen some of the moves that VCs have done. I think some of them are genuine. If you look, though, at their pages, they have very little diversity in their portfolios and on their team, right? So you have to wonder how genuine this is. There's some, I think, that are generally want to move in the right direction. They just don't know how. But that's why we're here. We're happy to talk to you about that. And then you have some folks that are using this as a PR move, right? And they're going to try to benefit from that and have the brand halo. I do think, though, it's very interesting. You have to be careful because if you do something that's not genuine, you can have very much backlash, and you could potentially be in a worse spot than you were starting off from like a brand halo perspective. But, we are optimistic. We've seen a lot of positive indicators. We've seen very strong founders who we've invested in and some we haven't invested in. And we just think some things are moving in the right direction, especially around diverse VCs being able to raise funds and deploy them in an effective way.
Thanks for that perspective. I want to go ahead and bring in some comments and questions from the stream that I'm seeing flowing in now. Camille says, loves this conversation. Changing the way we network is the key to changing to access to all types of capital. I appreciate LinkedIn for its role in facilitating that change. Camille, thanks for joining us. Ricky says, with VCs and making funding available to women and minority-owned small businesses, we also need to think about supporting them, lacking for them to succeed in those critical years, teaching, coaching, and mentoring and alternate resources that are out there to help them to get on the next level of success. Henri, speaking of mentoring, we just were talking about these racial protests are under this backdrop of this global pandemic. How are you advising your portfolio companies during this time? As I'm sure they're going through a slew of different business issues as we're on this national pause right now.
Yeah, so only about a third of our portfolio are African-American founders. And so 2/3 aren't. They're diverse, so they're women. So I've had many conversations with them, as a non-Black founder, how do I have these conversations with my Black employees and my non-Black employees? And I think, there's a balance. I'd said, depending on how many employees in your company are Black, don't force them to have that conversation, right? People of color have had more conversations now, at least for me personally, I've had more conversation with non-Black friends about Black topics in the last week than I have probably my entire life. And that's also hopeful, but it's also takes a lot out of you, right? It takes a lot to talk about your life in such a condensed period of time. And so be mindful of that, and maybe talk to the employees that you have of color and ask them, hey, this is what we're thinking. We want to have a firm conversation. But I don't also want to force you to have to be the voice for your entire race on that conversation. What are your thoughts around that? Are you okay with that? Do you have any recommendations? I'm here for you. I want to talk to you. And so that's what I personally have told my founders. Have those conversations either with that ERG group or with the founders. Let them know what you're thinking. Make sure that actually aligns with how do they think that will lead to change. And don't be the only one from a top-down perspective to say, hey, this is what we're going to do for the company to make this change. This is our stance. Try to include people in those conversations, and also acknowledge that these employees are going through an emotional, draining phase of talking to their friends, their old bosses, their current employees on one-on-ones. And sometimes it takes a lot out of them, and just be thoughtful of that.
It's a great perspective. I want to go ahead before I let you go, get to one question in the stream here from Steven. He's asking for some business advice. Is this a bad time to start a business, especially ones like restaurant or bars, or is this an opportunity? I don't know, Jared or Henri, if you want to take that away with some business advice, is this the right time to start your next play, I guess?
It's always hard to start a business. So, I mean, there's a lot of personal things that have to happen. I do think anyone who's starting a company should personally, financially be in a pretty sound position, either between you or your close family, being able to survive for the next year, 2 years, assuming no salary. But I mean, we work with entrepreneurs all day. I mean, it's a risk for sure. And sometimes if you have a dream, you have to go out and try to do it. It's not always going to be modeled out properly on paper in terms of if it's going to work or not, but sometimes you have to try to do it. I do think with the reopenings, there will be a churn in restaurants and bars. Hopefully a lot of them were able to stay around, but there definitely will be churn. I've heard of a number of really prominent restaurants and bars in New York that already closed. So there will be a void. People are going to go back out. I do think you have to be really thoughtful, though. You're going to have increased costs. There's going to be increased regulation with all the health concerns. You have to really make sure you can operate in this way. If you can only have 50% occupancy, that completely changes the model and potentially makes you unprofitable. Maybe think about delivery. I do think anyone starting a company, no matter what industry it's in, definitely focus on things that are scalable, that don't require a lot of fixed costs that you can leverage technology on, and just try to keep your margins as high as possible. That will definitely keep you in a good spot, and don't overhire. It's much more difficult to let somebody go than it is to bring them on later. So I'd be very prudent around cash. And last thing, just think carefully about your capital structure. There's loans, there's friends and family money, there's VC. Really think about which one is right for you and think about the proper risk and returns. VC, they want a lot of equity, but that money can go to zero. If you get a bank loan, then they're the first ones that have to get paid before you ever see a dime, right? So I would just think very carefully about all that and just try to be, nuanced and talk to advisors as well in your network.
Well, thanks for that business advice. And Henri and Jared, thank you for your leadership during this time and for joining us on Business Unusual. I've seen lots of comments in the stream thanking you for joining us. So thank you for taking the time and hope to speak with you soon.
Thanks for having us.
Great, thanks.
That was Henri Pierre-Jacques as well as Jared Tingle talking to us about Harlem Capital Partners and how we can make the venture capital industry more equitable moving forward. Joining us now on the show are two venture-backed founders of companies that are in different spaces. We have Porter Braswell joining us on the show right now, as well as B. Dixon, who I'm hearing is having a little bit of problem with her camera, so we can't see B right now, but hopefully she'll get her camera resolved issues. Porter, for now, thank you so much for joining us on today's show.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So Porter, talk to us a little bit about JopWell, the thesis behind it. You launched in 2015. What was the fundraising process like for you? We just spoke with Jared as well as Henri about some of the inequities. Talk us through what it was like raising money for your company back in 2015.
Yeah, so JopWell is a holistic diversity solution where we assist companies with the recruitment, the retention, and the support of Black, Latinx, and Native American students and professionals. We started the business because if you flash back to the conversations happening typically around the spring of 2014, a lot of tech companies were coming out with their lack of diversity stats. They claimed there was a lack of diversity because there was a lack of a pipeline. We knew that that wasn't the case, and so we decided to build JopWell to become that pipeline so companies could no longer say that they can't find the diverse talent. And so flash forward to today, we've raised about $15 million from incredible investors, including Cue Ball Capital, Andreessen Horowitz, Magic Johnson, Y Combinator, again, Keyport Capital, an incredible group of folks. And our fundraising process was a very unique and interesting period of time. When we launched the business, again, at the time, there was this national conversation around the lack of diversity. And so it felt a little bit similar to where we are today, that people were awakening to this fact that you can't keep saying that there's a lack of pipeline. Of course that there's talent out there, and of course our communities exist. And so when we went through Y Combinator and had the amazing opportunity to go through that program and to go through Demo Day, we had a very unusual process because we had the backing of a powerful institution. So we saw firsthand when you have an entity that vouches for you, how the doors open. And for far too long, founders of color don't get those opportunities. And so I'm glad the conversation has started to evolve where funds are looking to specifically invest in folks of color, and hopefully that opens up further doors.
And B, it's great to see you. I'm glad you resolved your camera issues. Thanks so much for joining us.
I had to refresh. Thank you.
It solves lots of problems on my end too. You'd be amazed. So thank you for joining us on today's show. Porter was just walking us through his fundraising process. Honeypot started in 2012. You launched in 2014. What was the fundraising process like for you? Was it easy explaining to VCs and other funders what the thesis was behind your beauty startup?
The process, well, anybody that's raising capital, right? Doesn't matter if you're Black, white, brown, man, woman. It's always hard. I want to start by saying that it just becomes harder when you add those other layers in. The process for us raising capital, it was actually a really beautiful process. You know, I won't complain about it. We heard a lot of no's. The Honeypot Company is a plant-based feminine care line. Really, you know, we specialize in everything that's feminine hygiene, whether that's from feminine washes, wipes, pads, tampons, you know, you name it, we do it. And, you know, typically when you're raising money, typically you're talking to men. You know, in the beginning, it was much harder than what it is now. You know, now it's actually really simple. You know, we're not raising right now, but you know, when that moment comes, it's a lot easier now to say, hey, I need X amount of dollars, because we're in a position where our business, you know, it's still very much ran like a bootstrap business, but we're in a situation where our business is doing well. You know, we're in a lot of retail doors, you know, so we're actually able to pitch the story in a way that makes it understandable for any investor to align with it, because if your product is in heavy volume retail and it's already selling, it's much easier than when we first got started. You know, we were just getting started. We were getting into Target. We had never raised money before. We had never been in a consumer packaged goods company. So there was so many levels of things that you know, that we were just learning, you know, but it's beautiful. You make a lot of mistakes. You know, you're extremely nervous. You know, like there's so many things that are going through. You're desperate. Oh man, you're so desperate. You know, but as long as you stick to it, even though it may be a hard journey, it's a beautiful one. You know, sure. We haven't raised as much as our competitors have raised, right? Mm-hmm. Is it because I'm Black? Could be, but it really, at this point, it really doesn't matter, because this is what the story is, and we know what to do with what we've been given. We just have to be lean and efficient, and run our business the best way possible.
Right. It's challenging raising capital. And as Porter was talking about, those first few steps are sometimes the most challenging for people who don't have access to the networks or to the funds or to the people to get that first retail store, in your case, be. Porter, you spoke a little bit about the focus in 2015 in the tech community on a lack of diversity. We're seeing a massive response right now across industries from executives who are responding to these protests. Talk me through a little bit about how, and if you think it's different this time than maybe it was in 2015, and if there's going to be a different outcome, and also how companies are coming to you. I'm assuming that Jopwell's seen a surge in companies who are hoping to partner.
Yeah, so we have seen an incredible surge, and I think both questions kind of come together in that this time it's different, because similarly in 2015, the conversation of diversity went from, oh, it's a feel-good story, to it's a business imperative. Now it's clear it's a business imperative. And so the conversations we're having with organizations is that they understand that in order to get the value out of diverse employees, you have to be able to allow individuals to bring their authentic selves to work. And when you can bring your authentic self to work, that's where you really want to invest in the culture. You want to work harder, you share your ideas, you feel comfortable stepping into potentially uncomfortable conversations, which of course then leads to innovation. And so what we are starting to see is that companies are starting to realize, and we're working with them, to how do you build equitable, inclusive cultures where people feel like they can bring their authentic selves to work. And so in this environment, it's a lot about talking about what's going on in America. How do you bring that conversation that's happening in every household and it's happening outside, how do you bring that into the workplace? And how do you have this dialogue so that employees and colleagues can create empathy and understand each other better? Because if you can accomplish that, now you have a diverse, inclusive, and equitable environment where where they want to be, and then you can get the best out of your employees. And so we're having a lot of internal dialogues with these organizations. We're hosting a lot of internal virtual events where we are moderating conversations about what's happening in America. And so that's been an evolution of the business where we're starting to engage in those dialogues, and it's been an incredible experience to have.
That's great. B, I wanted to talk to you. You mentioned your retail partners. One of them is Target. And before this pandemic started and before all these protests started, you appeared in a Target ad where you made a comment about opportunities for Black founders, Black women, that you hope you launching this company and being visible in stores like Target would provide. Walk us through the reaction to that ad. And do you think it would be any different if it happened today?
I think that, look, the reaction to the ad, people definitely had negative things to say. They didn't understand why I had to call out, Black girls, Black women. The reaction to the ad was that I should have kept it human focused. Some of those people thought that I was racist. People had all kinds of things to say, which is what humans do, right? We have opinions. And in my mind, I respect those opinions. However, I understand why it's so important as a Black woman founder who has raised venture capital money, right? Whenever you're raising money, you always first of all, you need to understand what the North Star of your company is, where you're going. But another thing that you have to be able to fold in to help the potential investor that you're talking to understand where you're trying to take your business and how you want it to grow. It's, you always point to a comp, right? For me, the reason why I said that is because Honey Pot, it will be beautiful for Honey Pot to be a comp for anybody, right? If we're lucky and we're able to exit at a substantial amount of money, so that when the next Black girl, I did say Black girl and I meant it, because there aren't tons of Black girls. I think that there's more that's happening right now where Black women are growing companies at a high rate. We understand that if we're going to get venture capital money, that exits likely need to be in the conversation, right? But companies like mine have to exit so that the conversation becomes more palatable and acceptable in the venture capital world. Because one of the reasons why, just like I think it was Henri, and I forget, and Jared, is that his name?
Yeah, that's his name.
And what Jared said, just like he just said earlier, is that they don't necessarily see a lot of us doing it, so they don't have anything to hold it to. And so that's why it's really important for Honey Pot to be successful, for Honey Pot to have a good exit, for Honey Pot to grow and do what it needs to do to be that business that actually does give our investors, a great return. And that was the reason why I said what I said. And I would say it 1,000 more times. Do I think that it would be different today? No, not in a real way. I think that reactively it would be different, right?
Right.
Reactively, those humans may not have said it, but they probably would have thought it. But I feel like there's some beautiful things happening in the community. There's some beautiful things happening in venture capital. Doesn't matter how they happen. What matters is that they happen. But what these venture capitalists and what these businesses that want to get involved need to realize is it cannot be reactive. It has to be proactive. And you can't just throw money at something. You have to throw money. If you're going to put money into something, you need to be able to care for it and to grow it and to help people to understand how to build their businesses, right? And so I don't really think, I think that they may not have been so open to say it at this point. but I still think that those humans would still be thinking that to themselves.
Right.
Honestly.
Right. Porter, Bee's talking a lot about normalizing access to capital for Black women and Black founders in particular. I wanted to get your take on equalizing access to opportunity. We're going through a massive recession right now, and unfortunately, a lot of companies during downtimes tend to take diversity and inclusion efforts and throw them out the door in some cases. So how are you ensuring, we see the BLS numbers, we know Black Americans are being impacted the most by unemployment right now. How are you advising companies right now to make sure they're being proactive about who they're furloughing, who they're laying off, and also who they're hiring at this time?
Yeah, so right now, what we're seeing, of course, as you mentioned, is that disproportionately Black and brown folks in general are being disproportionately affected more so than other communities. And so in moments like this, it's time to triple down on the commitments to building diverse, equitable, and inclusive cultures. And so one of the things that's incredibly important is that as we see this great rehiring start to occur, which hopefully it will, what are you going to do to ensure that your hiring practices are going to be able to bring in communities of color? How are you thinking about authentically reaching out to the community? How are you thinking about onboarding the community? How do you think about making sure and ensuring that when they get there, that they feel like they can not only succeed, but thrive within that context? And so now's the time to really triple down on all diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, put a strategy in place, top to bottom down, listen to all the employees and their wants, because diversity is a desire for many generations now, especially the younger generations coming in and demanding it. And so it's a unique opportunity for companies to get it right. By 2040, the majority of people in this country are going to be people of color. So as businesses want to understand this changing consumer behavior and what this country, where the country is moving towards, you have to have a workforce that will reflect that. And so now is a unique opportunity when the rehiring starts to become more diverse.
I want to bring in some members from the stream right now. Lino says, thank you for putting together this session, a very important issue, the inequity and access to capital for minority-owned business owners, even those with extensive experience. Coach says, love Bee's perspective. Just because people don't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Bee, before I let you both go, Porter was just talking about the opportunities here. What do you see as the opportunities coming out of these protests, and what are you hopeful for moving forward as we heal as a nation and as we talk as a business community about what this can mean for private institutions?
I think that the need for healing is absolute. It is incredible. I think that it's beautiful that humanity is coming together to put a collective energy out to really make sure that, the background of why everybody is so protesting is absolutely beautiful, right? Every single thing within our planet, right, is one thing. What I would like to see, not even with business, just with humanity, right? I feel like we go to business so quickly, and I'm a person that believes that you have to take care of yourself before you're going to go out and have a business and try to heal the world and make things, different. It's really important right now that we wake up as a community, not just meaning Black people, meaning people and humanity in general, and understand that we have to love each other. We have to care for each other, and we have to want to do that. So I hope that that the structures and the governments and everybody that these protesters are talking to, I hope that they can take in just a morsel of what people are asking for. People just want to be in a place that they just want to feel love. They just want to not have to worry about going to the grocery store and dying. If you're stopped by a cop, you don't want to have to think, wow, Black women don't necessarily want to have to tell their boys, don't wear a hoodie, don't go out at night, make sure that you comply. Nobody wants to do that. And so I really just hope that, we can come together and understand that we are all just human. This skin that is on the outside, it's literally just skin. And everything underneath looks the same as everybody else's, So I just hope and pray that we can wake up as earthlings and understand that that's what we are. All of these social constructs really don't have to be a thing, right? They are literally just the thing that was made up. And we do not have to buy into these systems. We can make our lives exactly what we want them to be, right? But we're gonna have to work together to do it because we all live on this planet together.
Mm.
And so what I hope to see is more love and kindness and generosity and more
Right. Thank you.
that on a global scale. You know?
I think it's such an important perspective. So thank you for bringing that onto the show. Ricky says we need to speak up and have open conversation on the disparity and making the gatekeepers aware of their unconscious biases. Andy says, yes, 100%. Culture is so important to this. It isn't just diversity and inclusion, as you said, Porter. Porter, anything to add before I let you go to Bose to be your remarks there? And, you know, any thoughts for those who are joining us on the stream right now?
Well, you know, I know that we're short on time, so I'll keep it short here. But I think for me, the biggest thing that I hope to see coming out of this is that folks that have stepped up to be allies, that they keep the same excitement and passion that they have today for the rest of their lives. And that this isn't just 1 month or 2 month or a quarterly thing that they are excited about. I want this to be something that people feel comfortable speaking up about, and they continue to be allies for the rest of their lives and not just for this moment in time. And to me, that would be success.
I agree with you there. Porter, B, thank you so much for joining us on today's show. Thank you for your leadership, and I hope to speak with you both soon.
All right, take care.
That was Porter Braswell as well as B. Arthur talking to us about inequities in the venture capital industry and a path forward after this pandemic and after the racial protests that are going on in the country right now. This is Business Unusual, a live show where we're coming to you from the LinkedIn news page to talk about the changing nature of work. Tomorrow, my colleague Susie Jackson will be back here with thoughts and some guests about personal finance. As the country begins to reopen, how are people thinking about their personal finances after a layoff or perhaps a pay cut? We'll have some great insights there, so be sure to join us tomorrow, 12 Eastern, from the LinkedIn news page. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Thank you so much for joining us.